We're going closer. Okay, yeah, good evening. Welcome to the April 23rd, 2018 meeting of the Board of Directors of the Sewer Authority, Midcoastside. The meeting's called to order. May I have a roll call, please?
Director Blanchard.
Here.
Director Penrose.
Here.
Director Slater Carter.
Present.
Director Rohrbeck.
Here.
Director Boyd.
Here.
And Director Clark.
Present.
Do we have any public comment? Do we have public comment? So we can go, okay, so now we go to item.
Well, I will make it, I'll make a quick comment, and that is if you go to the Sam Cleans Water, samcleanswater.org website for Sam, you will see newly added on it a wastewater resilience planning, which was a presentation in Berlin given by Keishan, our engineer. And it's about the wonderful job, work project that was done here. And not everybody gets to present at these conferences, and so we're very honored by the fact that Keishan went. And I suggest we watch it. Also, there is a 20-year capital improvement program with narrative, and the PowerPoint presentation on the website, it's under Board of Directors Agendas 2018. And if you want to sort of see what's been going on here, Sam is doing some very impressive work. And I think that you would be very impressed with all the progress that's being made, but especially with our great engineering staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Kappa. Very good. Okay. Any other comments? Okay, so then we will go to item 3, which is go into closed session. We will adjourn. Okay, so welcome
No,
back.
there's cookies.
Okay, so welcome back. Now we have, we have adjourned the closed session. We have nothing to report. So now we go on to item 4 and item 5. And do we have any more public comment for items? Okay. And item 6, the consent agenda. So we have 5 items. The first is to approve minutes for April 9. And then we have approved disbursements for April 23rd. Then C, receive monthly budget report for period ending March 31st. And then D, receive the quarterly investment report for March 31st. E, confirm cancellation of May 28th regular board meeting. So those, do we have any? Anybody?
I was not here. I was not here for the April 9th. So Leonard claims that as long as you read through the minutes and it's okay with you, it's okay. But I wasn't here, so I guess I should abstain from that.
I wasn't here either, so I'll abstain as well.
So moved.
Okay, so we have all, sorry. So all in favor, say aye. Aye. And so it's passed that, okay.
So who, were Director Rohrbeck and Clark were abstaining?
Yes.
From minutes only, correct?
Is it-
For minutes only, correct?
Yeah.
But we passed the whole consent agenda.
Right, correct.
Okay.
Now you go on item 7. And first is A, review and approve job description for general manager.
So, as directed at the last meeting, council and I went back and took those notes and made the changes, and what you have in front of you showing those changes reflects our understanding of the feedback that we received from the board at the last meeting.
Right. Do we have any more discussion about this?
Nope.
So can we just move ahead?
Move that we approve it.
Okay,
I'll second that.
second. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, anybody opposed? Okay, so now, super.
Yeah, that was quick.
Now go on. So now go to item 7B, discuss flow meters owned by the city of Half Moon Bay and the city's request to negotiate flow percentages for fiscal year 2018 and provide direction.
You have the attachments. Basically, the way this started was a request from the city, from John Dottie, regarding the city-owned flow meters and wanting sort of an understanding of the history of the responsibility for managing and maintaining those meters. So that's what started it. And then there, you see my response, and then there was a request for additional information and clarification. And then this item was also discussed last Tuesday as part of the city council meeting with regards to the SAM budget. So what I have attached are the two pieces of correspondence back and forth, and then the staff report for the, from the city council, or for the city council meeting. And part of that is predicated on a belief or understanding that SAM had the legal responsibility for managing and maintaining, and that had never been codified in anything, had been discussed ad nauseum in various meetings of the SAM board, all the way back to 2009 when they were installed by the city. But I could not find, after over 40 hours of watching old board meetings, and by the way, Director Blanchard, thank you so much for saying the year, because at many meetings, they would say the day and the month, but I had to double check to see what year. So thank you, because that makes my job easier when I have to go back and look. But, and looking at old minutes, old meeting, staff reports, and trying to follow what exactly happened. And it looks like at some point there might have been the intent for SAM to manage it, maybe as part of that, just managing the collection system, but it was never codified, there was no money put in the budget for it. So each time it was brought up, it seemed to be right at that point when there was a transition to a new SAM manager. So somewhere along the way, it never actually seemed to have been put in a contract or understood, or correspondence between the two agencies. And SAM staff that's been here for quite some time, as well as the vendor who has maintained those meters, understood that they've always been city-owned and managed. And so that was staff's understanding, that was the vendor's understanding, and somehow that got lost in translation. So this was just an ability to clarify that.
Question, are the flow meters in Granada and Montera owned by Granada and Montera, or owned by SAM?
Owned by SAM,
And maintained by SAM?
maintained and we calibrate them. The only one was Valimar, that I believe was originally installed,
Okay,
but Sam took that over quite some time ago and has been managing and maintaining that.
and it just hasn't been doing the cities, just been doing Montera and Granada?
Well, Granada, the
If I
ones,
could,
yes, please.
the city
Yeah.
acted independently to install its own meters,
Mhm.
and,
Who,
Opposed.
who installed Monteras in El Granada?
SAM,
SAM installed them,
they're
Yes.
part of they are
And
SAM
maintain them.
infrastructure.
got it.
And
So
they were oh, sorry.
So, sometime back, Half Moon Bay installed its own meters, went out on its own and selected meters, selected contractors, selected engineering.
What
Got
was,
And- hang on, excuse me.
I just
I'm
don't want
I'm just
to-
gonna lay out a couple of
Finish.
things here. There's a very detailed letter from your city manager, and I've read through it very carefully. And I want to affirm, having been here the whole time, that this was an action that Half Moon Bay took to install its own meters, operate its own meters, calibrate its own meters, and proposed kind of lightly, I believe 2 times, that SAM take ownership of equipment that Half Moon Bay had spec'd and purchased and engineered and installed, and we never came to agreement on that. Also, there was never any notion that any of the JPA about how things were gonna be paid for was in any way impacted by the meters that Half Moon Bay decided to install.
Got it, thank you.
Any more?
Yes,
It's my understanding that John Dowdy met with Beverly today, and
yes.
Everything, it was cordial and collegial meeting, is my understanding, so that's good.
Yes, it was a cordial meeting. There was some discussion about perhaps a misunderstanding on my part about what the intent of bringing this up was by the city. I could only go by what was in the letter and what was in the staff report, which seemed to link it to the budget for 18-19. I was informed this morning at the meeting that that wasn't the intent. The intent was really to clarify the ownership and responsibility, and somehow it also got attached to the discussion of the 18-19 budget, but that's what the staff report said, and it also was part of the letter saying that, and I will say, the first discussion that the member managers had back in, was it the end of January, beginning of February, when we were talking about the budget, Half Moon Bay had expressed concern that they did not support and affirm that those calculations were correct. So my understanding of what the intent of this was to correct what they thought was an error, and in trying to verify that, they discovered that the meters weren't working. So I understood it to be connected to the budget, and I understood that from watching the council meeting, that was also discussed. But after this morning, and Kishan was there as well, that they were, at least staff, John Dottie and Vivian Housen, were interested in the discussion being prospective. So not being applied to the budget that's in discussion right now for 18-19, but really providing a baseline data set that could be used to develop an understanding for the next year, which would be 19-20.
To review it in the mid-year budget.
Yes, and to review it in the mid-year,
Yeah.
but not necessarily to come back and ask for changes, but
No, not necessarily, but just give us, 4, 5, 6 months to look at the data and see where we are with it.
And part of the issue is that because of the type of meter and where they're placed, when the flows are high, they're actually submerged. So when it's raining, we don't get data from those particular meters. So dry weather is when they work and can be best compared to Sam's meter readings. And so the assumption is that the city will be getting them calibrated, and that we would have probably May through October
Right,
of being able to get the data for comparison purposes.
right.
And that would give another set of baseline data. I will also say that, and this is funny, because after having gone back to 2009 and watching meetings going forward every couple of years or so when this comes up, that the discussion about going to a flat rate rather than flow was also brought up. And of course, clearly, that's something that has to be negotiated through a JPA amendment, because the JPA is very clear that it's flow-based. But that, they did raise that point this morning, that anything that could be done to simplify and normalize the rates from year to year, as well as anything that can sort of take the contentiousness or doubt out of the variances from year to year, would be helpful in repairing the relationship. And I don't know, Kishan, if you had any other,
We've talked about that on and off. It's really clear that the regulators are very interested in us staying on a fee-for-use kind of basis, because that creates a natural incentive to reduce inflow and infiltration. And, basically to attend to your system, if you're flat rate, what's the incentive, right? It's also one of those things where, we want us, each of our colleagues to be incentivized to take good care of their system, and because we're on the hook for the money, right? Each one of us is. So it's come up a few times, but in looking at the regulatory landscape, it really doesn't look like something the regulators would warm to, and it doesn't seem to be a good incentive. Like if I think it's good for you to do that, then I would expect you to think it's good for me to do that too, and it's how much we use. So I was curious, I was reading through the letter. It's a little concerning that you're seeing that kind of additional flow. Just curious.
For the audience, could you tell the TV audience what the changes are?
Well, it's, Half Moon Bay for years has trended around, what, 52% of the overall
Yeah,
flow?
yeah.
And right now it's trending around 60%.
55.
Which it's sort of bounced between
Okay.
55.
The letter referenced 60, but it's,
Yeah.
it's trending higher, and, I mean, we all know.
No increase in,
Well, we've seen things where there were some problems with meters, and Leonard, were he here, I'll play the little song. If, what? No, we had a situation where there was a problem with our metering, and it wound up with Granada carrying some freight for the rest of us, because the way that we do the math, the way that SAM was constructed, we have fewer meters than we have actual inflow, so some of it's calculated. And Half Moon Bay paid extra to the tune of about, what, $150,000 extra?
Half Moon Bay
No,
or?
No, Granada
Granada,
paid
sorry.
extra, and it was significant money,
Yes.
but we all discussed it, and Granada decided, let's sleeping dogs lie, let's move forward, let's keep a good eye on our meters, let's keep this equitable, we'll be fine. A few years later, Montera went through something very similar, again, we took a look at it, we got things calibrated and fixed. It's one of these things where we may drift for a bit, but we always get it back on course. And now Half Moon Bay's seeing it, so what we've done the previous times is we've spent some time looking at is it something going wrong in the instrumentation, or is it something going on with I&I, or are there new discharges that we don't know about, or I know that Montera from time to time has looked to see might there be a leak, like groundwater leaking in through a crack. We actually found one once. We had a pipe going under a creek, and when we televised the pipe, we saw daylight as we passed under the creek. That one was one we fixed in a hurry. It was very expensive to fix, but it was obviously very important to fix, and we were glad to find it and fix it. So when things like that happen, everyone's always curious, okay, is our instrumentation broken, or is there something going on in the field that needs more eyes? So I hope you're bugging your engineer to see if there might be anything to account for it.
yeah, my feeling is that, you know, when you talk about things like drift and happened in Montara, happened in Granada, now it's happening in Half Moon Bay, that's even stronger reason to support flat rate structure. And I'm
But
in
each of those
favor of
times-
that.
Well, each of those times, we found a substantial error in some physical aspect of our
Doesn't mean we
system.
don't keep our flow meters and watch our flow meters and watch to see if there's something happening there. But I think fixing it at a flat rate avoids the contentiousness and the trouble. You find something, you fix it. Pretty straightforward.
If you flush it, you pay for it too, so that's, I mean,
Well, I don't wanna get into a long,
well, I'm gonna
you know,
get into some,
argument
I'm
about
gonna
it,
get
but
into some
I-
simple politics. My customers, my constituents expect to pay for what they use, and they don't expect to pay for what you use. And it's just really simple. It's fee for service. It's the way that the sewerage is being paid for increasingly more and more all around the country. And going back to a flat rate is becoming less and less the norm, and especially as regulators come in and say, you've got to deal with your inflow and infiltration. And when we see numbers jump up, it could well be another instrument problem, but it's very often, like with our creek situation, it's something that needs to be fixed.
Definitely needs to be checked on.
For
No
instance,
question.
years ago, Paul went through our district looking for manhole covers with holes in them.
Yeah.
And found a number of them that were in areas where water puddled during wet weather. And we changed those out to solid covers, but it was a financial incentive of needing to reduce our I&I And, that's why Half Moon Bay's putting in the smart covers and
Right.
others are as well. But financial incentives are very powerful to getting things done instead of saying, oh, well, let's wait.
Well, and I gotta say, it's not contentious at all to send a firm out to go calibrate a meter. That's just good engineering. And it sounds like, my guess, I'm just gonna speculate, my guess is that at some point turnover in both agencies wound up with the loss of institutional knowledge about who was doing the servicing on those meters. And here we are with stuff overgrown and some not working, and it's in the report that
I didn't write the report.
no, but Half Moon Bay's meters,
It's not your fault.
one of them had to be dug out from a bunch of vegetation, so that one hadn't been serviced in a while. That's what's in the letter.
I'm not saying it's accurate, I'm
I'm
saying
not-
I didn't write the report.
I'm saying, I'm reading a letter from the city manager, that's what it says, so, or, actually, I read several letters, I don't know who wrote it. Let me not ascribe it to anyone, but if anything wasn't getting serviced, or if someone thought that Sam had the responsibility when it was really the city, you know, somewhere we had a communication breakdown. So let's get that fixed. Sounds like it is fixed. I know there was talk of a contract. I know that, I recall that some of our people went with the people doing the calibration on, you know, in previous years, but I don't know what's happened since. I remember that because I was asking, was the calibration being done with or without Sam's involvement? And what I recall was that Sam was there and watched the work being done. And that made it a little easier to be more comfortable about the numbers that we were being reported. Because I mean, when we do it jointly, we've got good reason to feel good about the numbers. When we do it separately, you know, it's somebody else's numbers. So that's why it was interesting and good to know that we were working together with the city on that at the time. But
Well, I have a question. You said you spent 40 hours working on a request from the city of Half Moon Bay.
Yes.
I remember when Montera put a request for some kind of information, and it was in Montera's interest. And you got pretty well chewed out by one of Half Moon Bay's, SAM board members.
Yes.
And as I recall, there was sort of a de facto policy created.
No, there was actually a written policy that the board adopted subsequent to that to clarify to everyone. There's been a couple of incidents post the adoption of that policy where it's requested as a Public Records Act
Right.
request, which is something I legally have to respond to no matter what. And so I find that now, instead of a simple information request, I tend to get PRA requests from the member agencies. And that, I don't wanna say it's intentional to get around that, but it certainly puts me in a different obligation than just a regular request from one of the managers to me.
Well, I will ask, has Montera made a public records PRA request like that, or?
No, the only request that we have received from Montera since that policy was adopted that was voluminous was dealing with the recent state inspection that came here and needing records, historical records related to the collection system.
And Granada?
Granada has asked for some information, but not too much large scale. Same thing, the inspection, the collection system,
Right,
needing
okay.
those records, which as the contractor, we're obligated to provide. Outside of that, I don't recall much in the way of requests to do special projects or special requests that are sort of outside of the normal, just providing information between agencies.
From Montera or Granada?
Yes, I don't wanna say there haven't been, but none that have really sort of stand out in my mind as being beyond sort of the normal, just sharing information that we can put our hands on relatively easily.
I'm curious about the time, I mean, the time put in, that's a lot of time. There was a reference to a SAM obligation in the city's letter,
Mhm.
but no reference to a document. or a contract or a board meeting where something was done.
I wanted to make sure that something hadn't been committed without turning into a contract, that somehow at a board meeting that there had been some agreement amongst the SAM board that this was something staff would do, and somehow it just never got codified into a separate document. And since most of the people who would have been here during that time are not here anymore, I did not, and because the request was coming in sort of that same venue of this is going to be discussed in a very public way, having to do with the budget, I did not want to misrepresent the history.
No, and my feeling is that in defense of Half Moon Bay's position on this, asking you to get the information, Half Moon Bay was not doing that to be difficult, obviously. It's a lot of money, and Half Moon Bay wanted to know what the records reflected, and the fact that the records were in such poor shape is not the fault of Half Moon Bay.
Well,
Nor is it your fault.
I
So-
would say that the
what
records
records?
weren't in.
Can I finish?
I'm sorry, yes.
What I was saying? So the records were not clear in showing who was in fact responsible for taking care of the meters in Half Moon Bay. Since the records did not adequately describe that, conclude that, then Half Moon Bay had a right to ask for that information because it's gonna cost our ratepayers a lot of money. From going from 52% up to over 55% is a huge amount of money. So we have got to protect our ratepayers. We're not trying to make things difficult. It's a shame that it took that many hours. It shouldn't have.
I'm gonna respectfully disagree
Sure.
vigorously.
Go ahead.
Half Moon Bay decided on its own years ago to purchase and install and operate meters. That was never a SAM obligation, never. It's not SAM's job to go find your records of your decisions to purchase and install and maintain and operate these meters. This is an assumption being pushed off on SAM with an imputation that SAM has been in some way not doing its job. That's incorrect.
Excuse me. What I understand was the records were not very clear. There were several times it was stated that the board wished that SAM would take over the maintenance of the meters, but it was never formally decided. Nor was it decided that Half Moon Bay would therefore be responsible.
Half Moon Bay
The
is responsible
decision
for
was
its own.
not,
Oh,
I'm
not.
sorry, I'm sorry, you're being argumentative, and I don't think that's necessary.
Well, okay,
All
let me
I'm
be assertive
saying
then.
is, I was saying, I'm not finished. I was saying that if it took 40 hours to go through the records, and there was nothing definitive found, but there were a lot of times, or several times at least, that it was mentioned that SAM might take over the maintenance of the flow meters and the calibration of the flow meters, then it left some question in the mind of Half Moon Bay ratepayers as to whose job it was. Now, Half Moon Bay has said, okay, since there's nothing definite in the record, we're gonna go ahead and go with the 52% because that's what seems to be fair.
55.
I'm sorry, 52%?
55?
No, 55, Deborah.
55, excuse me, 55%.
So if
Well,
I might,
I have a couple questions
Yes.
and comments. First, are you,
I-
I wanna weigh in on this too, but.
okay,
Are you?
go ahead,
okay.
I'll follow.
First, well, I'll go to the one that was just came up. General manager met with the city public works director, and it turns out that some of those meters are inundated when it rains a lot. Was there any indication that situation would be remedied?
Both Kishan and I mentioned that would be something that would need to be looked at, because clearly the only time that the data, we could use that data in comparison to the SAM-owned meters would be dry weather, because clearly until they resolve the INI issue, the meters will not read properly because of where they're placed and the type of meters they are. They said they would be looking at that as, just generally looking at it as they take over, sort of clearly delineating the responsibilities, which is also occurring in the contract collection services as well, getting clearer contracts because of this sort of assumption of responsibility as opposed to clear lines of responsibility. And that as the owner of those meters, it's their responsibility to determine the best placement of them and to resolve any issues with them. But we did tell them in the months where it rains and there's an issue, that data just will not be available because of where the meters are placed and that they won't register.
Okay, here's a comment related to that. It occurred to me that this happens, meters get inundated. I've heard about this before, and we have a table from 2 of the metering locations in the city that show where the missing days are. And we have the rain information in the general manager's report, how much rain happened on those days, virtually none.
Well, and part of that was because the meters have not been made to work, which now they have, but now they have to also be calibrated. And then from that point going forward, the city will, I think, have confidence that the meters are operating correctly. That information will be accessible, so we can look at it and do a comparison, because currently, even though it's transmitting, they haven't been calibrated in quite some time, is my understanding.
I'm just saying that from what I can see, all that I have is what was in the packet, that there's no correlation between heavy rain and the meters not working. So I don't know where we go from that.
That was a different reason, but that reason has been resolved. But once again, that's something where the city maintaining it, if they have a contract with a vendor to maintain those, they would be able to determine that they were not operating properly a lot quicker. And I know since I've been here, I have never heard that we were responsible. I know we pulled data from it, but every time there's been an issue, we've notified the city that there was a problem. So my staff were not aware that there was an assumption that we were responsible for it.
So if I could jump back in.
Yeah.
Let me be super clear. This was never a SAM obligation. Never. There were people at board meetings who wanted to make this a SAM obligation. They were the representatives from the city of Half Moon Bay. Full stop. These were never SAM meters. They were never SAM responsibility. Half Moon Bay brought them to the table. Half Moon Bay bought them, installed them, operated them, and had them calibrated. There was never an agreement at this board table to do more than look at the data. There was never any agreement that billing would be done off of it. There was never any agreement that SAM would operate or calibrate or repair. Frankly, the manner in which this was presented has created a lot of work. It now has people's backs up because of the manner in which it was broached and the assertions which were made without any basis. If there's an obligation on SAM's part, there should have been a reference to where and when that was made. There should have been a reference to the contract, or the people who made the decision, or the board meeting, or the date, or anything. Instead, it's a flat assertion that this was SAM's responsibility, and then a follow-on with a whole bunch of language about how SAM did a terrible job of discharging its responsibilities. Well, let's be perfectly clear. This was all Half Moon Bay's responsibility, and if you want to blame anybody, look in the Half Moon Bay history. I don't know where that breakdown in communication happened. That's what this is and was. Let's just understand that. But I'm not going to sit here and let somebody point a finger of blame at SAM on something that isn't SAM's doing.
We are SAM.
No, you're Half Moon Bay.
We're
And
SAM.
in the letter from Half Moon Bay, under your signature, came under the seal of the city of Half Moon Bay,
Jim.
and the assertions made, and look, it's a communication breakdown. They're never fun. They're never fun.
We could do,
But let's not build some image of Sam negligence out of some misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding, that's all it is.
you wanna, well, we-
Scott, I don't wanna blame anyone, but I think if we're going forward, we should work toward having a flat rate structure. That will alleviate a lot of these problems. We can work collaboratively, decide a fair, a portion that will continue to give us stability, to give us reproducibility, so we'll know what we're paying. It will stop some of this contentiousness. It's true that the flow meters have been a real mess, but if we agree to work toward having a flat rate structure, we can eliminate a lot of this contentiousness and make things much more predictable in the future. So that's the position that Half Moon Bay, I believe, is gonna work toward having a flat rate structure.
thank you,
Through
Catherine.
the lawsuit?
Catherine,
Well, what?
I said through the lawsuit?
What's that about? What are you talking about,
Well-
the lawsuit?
Yeah.
That's,
What does that mean?
I will finish my comments.
Please,
Thank you.
please,
Thank you.
explain that.
yeah.
I was at the Half Moon Bay City Council meeting on Tuesday, as you guys know. And I, actually asked in my public comment if this 55 point whatever percent, operations charge, or operation system basis for SAM charge, was going to prevent the, budget from being passed, because I certainly don't want SAM to end up with the problems it had. And I didn't get an affirmative answer, but the whole presentation by staff and approval by the Half Moon Bay City Council appeared to be aimed towards the 18-19 budget, the budget year under discussion. And so, I'm trying to, resolve what our general manager Beverly has just told us and what I saw at the city council meeting. I'm really confused. I will go back and watch that meeting, but it would seem very clear to me in the audience and reading the staff report at the time that was all about this current year's budget. And my concern still is about making sure Sam has, because remember, Half Moon Bay did not pass the budget last year, and 2 years without a budget for Sam from Half Moon Bay is going to be particularly problematic. And so I'm really confused, and I'm wondering what's going on.
And could you answer my question about what that has to do with the lawsuit?
No,
I didn't think so.
If
I
I
would be
could just
happy to
clarify.
explain it off the record, but
Yeah,
right
I
now
don't-
we're in a meeting.
I don't need to hear it, that's why you shouldn't have brought it up at the meeting.
Actually, the clarification I'd like to make is, the reason why this would take, it can't be done between the managers, and I know there was some, hint at that some negotiation would take place between Half Moon Bay and the SAM manager, and we would be able to come to some sort of collaborative agreement on this. It's very clear in the JPA agreement that the costs are based on flow. So it would have to be resolved through legal, an amendment to the JPA. And I think that perhaps with also answering some of the other questions that are hopefully going to be answered with the lawsuit on some of the language that the agencies might disagree on, that could be a means for resolving this discussion. But clearly in the JPA, it says the regular administrative and O&M costs for SAM will be allocated based on flow. And at the December 10th, 2012 meeting, and just, you know, I put copies on your the table in front of you. the staff made a recommendation after discussing this with the member agencies on how best to do the flow measurement. That was actually approved by the SAM board on December 10th, 2012, on how the measurement would be calculated and how SAM would approach it, because I guess at one point in time it was a 3-year average and it was a 1 year, and then it was, so
Yeah.
this was the last, I would say, official step by the SAM board in determining flow other than calibrating and correcting.
I'd like to add that the reason that we changed it to a running average, kind of a trailing average, was to buffer out trends. So if in a given year something trended up quickly, we would have time to get on top of that without having rate impact to any of the member agencies. So there's a way to buffer it out and kind of smooth out those bumps, and that was, I think, a really good thing that we did. And we should still be using that. We're still using that calculation, correct?
The one from 2012 is the one that we
Good.
look at.
So, Ari, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Had the meters that Half Moon Bay installed been maintained and used to gather information about flows, do you agree that we might have spotted some aberration earlier? Like your
Yeah, go
your
ahead.
contribution to what comes into the plant has been trending up. If
Is
you're,
that clear? I'm not sure that that's the
well,
case.
using the mechanism that we have in place as an agreement amongst the 3 agencies, yes, it is clear. I'm quick to allow for there could be some instrumentation failure.
I didn't think there was a trend, I thought it was
Yeah.
pretty stable at 52% for a long time, and then this year it jumped up to 55, I don't call that a trend.
I'd like to see an engineering report to help us take a look at the numbers, but let's just assume,
By all means.
whether it jumped or trended, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If somebody's operating and maintaining the meters that Half Moon Bay put in as a way to provide additional insight into what's happening, I think we all agree that if there was an aberration, some difference between what you're measuring and what Sam is calculating, we could have spotted that and started to investigate it much sooner. But without that additional source of input, we're left with the mechanism that we have, and then looking at the monthly reports and seeing if, looking at the trend data there. I mean, that's how Granada spotted the problem. So we have a monthly report, it's in there, and Leonard was looking at it, and it kept going up. A little bit at a time, but kept going up. And it took us a long time, I mean, 2-3 years maybe,
Yes.
to get to the bottom of it. But get to the bottom of it we did, and we corrected it, took several corrective actions. But I'm just curious, the contention of which you speak, when,
As exhibited here. yeah.
no, no, the contention here is, I don't wanna pay more money. And somebody wants to say, hey, you guys, I don't wanna pay more money.
Thank you.
Why don't we fix my rate?
I don't
And-
think that's true.
No,
I hear 2 people at the table talking about that, and both are in the situation
No,
of we're paying more
Both
money.
people
That's
from
not what I
San
was
Bay
saying,
have said
Scott.
we are paying what we feel the JPA has asked us to pay and what we think is fair, which is 55 point whatever it is %. All we've asked for is after we have calibrated our meters, which were our responsibility, which responsibility we did not know about, and maybe we should have, but, and we're accepting responsibility for that, we are paying the 55%.
No, I'm not saying you're
At
not,
the time of the mid-year budget, we would like to look again
I think that's smart.
and see if there is in fact an increased flow from Half Moon Bay. If there is not, then maybe we need to have a discussion about how we would recalibrate the cost to us.
I think that's right on.
But that's at the time of the mid-year budget, there is no contention from Half Moon Bay at this point,
Well,
and hasn't been, about whether or not we owe 55%.
well, I think the letter may have made it look like that. Let's move past that. I'm gonna encourage you to go one better on that. We get monthly numbers, and they're in every agenda packet. We have actually much more frequent data. If we wanna look at the data every single day, we can do that. We've got, our data is available to the member agencies. And the half move A flow meters, that data is available online to city staff at any time. I would strongly encourage you to check with your engineer and see if there is something that might account for this trending or jumping differential. Because it's, I don't care which member agency it is, when somebody shifts that, whole percentage points, we all wanna understand what's going on. Okay, now, I mean, that's, the reason I was asking you the questions, Harvey, is I'm intrigued by the notion of the flat rate. Now, I'm curious, how would that work? Would you be obligated to send no more than 52%?
What would work would be a collaboration between the member agencies to, based on data, good data, to come up with a fair allocation that at the time was based on the flow for, let's say, a 1 or 2 year period, and that rate structure was adhered to for a period of 3 years, 5 years, so some reasonable amount of time, so that we could have stability in and not have to fight about whether or not the flow meter was submerged or the INI was false this time. It would just allow some sense of continuity in the way the agency would be built.
So that's what we did with the 2012 thing.
Right,
we took
I'd like to go back to the 2012.
No, we're still operating that way, correct?
Oh,
Yeah, that's the deciding that we would look at a calendar year, so we would look from January to December because of the timing of the budget, that
Right.
was the best period of time to look at, and how we would basically, the meters that are in place
But we're using a running average, right? Going
for
back,
the 12 months. Over that 12 months. We're not, it's not a
I
continuously
thought we had a
moving.
multi-year running average to buffer it out.
Well, I would have,
I'm gonna ask that you ask Director Warren,
yes.
so we don't have to do 40 hours of anything, to see if he can point you to that. If I can find it, I'll let you know. But Harvey, my understanding was that we had already taken an action that would give us, with a trailing average, we should never see the full jump. It would be something that would start to climb in terms of what anybody's being charged, but that would give us time to get on top of it and address it before any one agency had a big shakeup on the allocation. So that, we've already attempted to do what you're saying, and if it's a 3-year running average, then we've actually already got something that should give us a good start on addressing that. The business, let me mention something though about a submerged meter. A submerged meter is a badly engineered meter if your goal was to measure anything other than dry weather. If the goal is to measure dry weather, submerge all you want in the rain, that's not a problem. You need to make sure it can handle that, but things like that, we solve that through good engineering. You get the meters that you want. I mean, we've done a lot of work on meters to make sure we have the right angle of incidence, that it's placed at an appropriate elevation, that we know when they fail, we defend against shorts, and there's all sorts of things that we've talked about here at this board table, and the engineers have taken care of a lot more than we ever talked about here. So I want to make sure that as we talk about this, we talk about making sure we got the right instrumentation. We did several times here talk about, let's meter all the lines. And we got some numbers and decided that it wasn't worth it. But all 3 member agencies were here for all of those discussions. So, I mean, we're all interested in solving these kind of problems, but if we're gonna talk about a flat rate, then I've got a lot of questions about how that would work.
Would you invite the public?
Thank you. And I certainly was not my intention to stir up the hornet's nest, but I thought it was an interesting conversation and issue with regard to the flow meters, because frankly, no one in the realm I was working with could answer the question as to whether the city owned them, first and foremost, and whether we managed and maintained them. And I think, I'll say this, and I don't want to create more stir out of this, but frankly, we still are having a hard time deciding and determining why the city through the operating budget pays for all the other flow meters and all the management of those, and we are still responsible for paying independently our own flow meters. But I understand the decisions were made, but you have to you have to, I think, at least consider why that might have been a concern to us and why we didn't think that would be the actual situation with that.
If
But-
you want, I can explain that.
but I don't, I just saying the reason why there was partially this issue of along with some other background that I don't wanna go into as to why some assumptions were made that apparently they were not ours to maintain and deal with it. So,
Okay.
separate from that issue, when we talk about the flat rate, what we're talking about is getting rid of and stopping this insanity with the flow meters. We're having this extended conversation about what type of flow meter, submerged or not. We're spending with Oratech tens of thousands of dollars, each of us in our own right, whatever it may be, for Oratech or whoever it is, Calcon or whoever, to come in and replace, repair, calibrate, all of these things for very minimal value in the end that couldn't be addressed through a connection-based flat fee. And we're not trying to take away our responsibility and our obligations. All we're suggesting is we spend a lot of time spending money fixing, maintaining, calibrating, and dealing with these flow meters for primarily the purpose of basically divvying up the cost of the operations budget. We think that that's sort of a waste of public monies, it's a waste of all of our time, frankly, for limited benefit. There are places where we obviously need to have meters for other reasons. We agree that probably putting a meter at the end of the IPS is a good thing because we'll know if there's something going on upstream. There's reasons to have the flow meters in there. We're not arguing that point. We had a very good conversation about that today, in fact. So we think there is, the question always comes around to the point of can we in fact find a better way to deal with that? We're not gonna answer that tonight. All we're suggesting is we put it on the table, we think about it, and we deal with it. No one's trying, including the Half Moon Bay, is trying to get out of its fair share of responsibility. But frankly, as one of the managers and dealing with your managers, the struggle we have is having a budget that's fluctuating with that and not being able to be predictable. Everybody's having to deal with rate studies. It's difficult to deal with rate studies when you're dealing with a fluctuating cost factor. SAM is a fixed cost. The treatment side is a fixed cost. There's no reason why that can't be divvied up and done a lot easier than going through this process of arguing every year, perhaps, about the flows, about the flow meters, the accuracy of those, spending, giving Oratech a ton of money to do that deal when there is perhaps a simpler way to deal with that, and I don't know what that simpler way is. We leave all things on the table. But when you go back to the 2012, that still is a flow-based divvying up. I understand it wasn't designed around,
Smoothing out the spikes.
smoothing out the spikes,
Yep.
which is appreciated for all. I know everybody appreciates that. But it's still ultimately about checking the flow meters. So that's why we're just saying, let's put it on the table. We're not gonna answer tonight. We may not answer it next week. We may not answer it next year. But for the purposes of all of our operations at the local level, outside as member agencies, having predictability in the budget and being able to deal with that and create rate studies makes a lot of sense, and lining the pocket of Oratech doesn't seem like a very good plan in the end if we can find another way to do that without doing that. Not that I care about Oratech, I don't have stock in them or anything, but it just seems like a crazy thing. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. I understand not knowing the history, I can certainly understand the question about the fairness of the cost of the Half Moon Bay meters. I hope you understand now, that was the decision that Half Moon Bay made, and the reasons given were they wanted to have better information, and they thought it was worth the cost, and that's all the explanation they gave us. So, but, let's be clear, that's not actually part of the fairness equation. I do appreciate, well, it's not, because that was a completely independent decision by one member agency to go do a thing, and it cost money. But I've long advocated for, let's just meter everything, because we actually need to know for the hydraulic operation of this thing. And, the billing is always complicated. I mean, you know, people ask me why we don't put meters on sewers on homes. Right, exactly. To the person who doesn't know how that would work, seems like a fine idea. To everybody else, it's the worst idea in the world. You know, it's not worth it. It's not even worth describing. But I do appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for sharing the thoughts about the economics of it and the complexity of it. That's helpful. I think that's a basis around which we can start to try to problem solve. I do want to make sure that if we're not doing some kind of trailing average thing to buffer this out, that we take a look at that again, because none of us likes a big jump. The costs will fluctuate or go up, right? PG&E goes up, insurance goes up, everything goes up. But we don't want any surprises. We want something on a trend line, not some spike. And if we're not, for some reason, doing that, I'd like us to bring that back. And but one way or another, if we could bring it back with what we know about that. I'll try to find that.
Well, and the other thing I just wanted to clarify is that we actually went through the explanation of what happened in 2016, which was determining, we had Oratech come in and look at the Montero meter, and it was determined that it was not calibrated per the manufacturer's recommendation. It had been previously calibrated by another company. So once Oratech fixed that issue, clearly, anytime you adjust one member agency, somebody else is gonna go the opposite direction. But that was, at that point, we couldn't determine when and where that calibration had occurred, and the best we could determine is, it was at the moment that that meter was installed. So for the life of that meter, it had been incorrectly managed from the calibration standpoint. And so the reason why you're seeing the impact of that more this year is because last year that change happened in the middle of the year. So 6 months of 2016, it was the incorrect calibration or setting of the meter, and the second half of the year was the corrected setting of the meter. 2017 is the first year where you have all 12 months properly recorded for the setting. And that's the difference. And we said that at the time, that you would notice it. And in fact, almost immediately, the city representatives wanted to know what the changes were on the month-to-month basis, because it was already starting to become noticeable. So we've been explaining it since mid-2016, that the reason why it has changed is because that meter was not set properly when, as far as we can tell, when it was installed, which means Montero was overcharged. And that discussion came up in that meeting, and it was like, okay, because we can't pick a definitive point, and you can't go back and recreate that data, it's going forward. That's what the discussion was in 2016, and we've
I'm sorry,
had
which meter was that?
the one at Montero.
Montero pump station.
Yeah, and it was because it was not set properly based on the conditions of that section of the pipe. And I'll defer to the engineer to explain it. The precision and it's kind of the same reason why we go back and recalibrate, is we want to make sure that the accuracy is dependent upon the placement and the settings. We discussed this in 2016. We discussed it pretty much almost every month in 2016 because the numbers were clearly different, starting with that change. But it wasn't enough that when you averaged it over the year that you really saw a huge variance. But 2017 was the first year where all 12 months of that meter was operating as the manufacturer says it should. That's why you're seeing the change. Had that meter been done years ago when it was first installed, you probably would have seen that change then. And we've been explaining the anomaly ever since. At, gosh, almost every month we get a question from staff wanting, meaning city staff wanting to know the explanation for the percentages of the flow. So it's not something we've hidden, it's not something that we've refused to explain. It was a change that was identified and it was corrected. And in that particular case, the correction went in the direction of lowering the flow for Montera and increasing it for Granada and Half Moon Bay. Then when we put in the Frenchman's Creek meter, because that was always just an estimated flow, when we put that in, we found that the flow at Frenchman's Creek was greater than we had estimated. So guess what that did? That dropped Half Moon Bay a little bit and increased Granada. So every time we get more data points, it's helpful. But as long as someone is paying more and someone is paying less and it varies, we will have this discussion and this distrust. I would like to say that while the thought might have been to just clarify something, it did not come across to Sam as a simple clarification. It very much came across as an accusation. And that was how it was worded. Now, understanding after our meeting this morning and understanding that that wasn't the intent, that really it was just to get to understand the history of it, I think, once again, there's a way where we can bridge across past hurt feelings, insults, misunderstandings, whatever, however it gets couched. We can probably do a better job of that, all of us, all 4 agencies. But it certainly came across and was projected, and I believe some of the words that were actually used is Sam failed to do its job. That doesn't start the conversation very well, which is why I wanted the history. That's why I spent the 40 hours reading old minutes and watching old videos. Is I didn't want to misspeak because I knew that would only make the situation worse. So, just to clarify that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
I have a comment and another question and another comment. If the city of Half Moon Bay was thought, assumed, or was convinced that the meters that they bought and installed had become a SAM responsibility, they should have documentation. This kind of thing shouldn't happen without paperwork, and I sure haven't seen it. And Sam hasn't seen it. He doesn't have any paperwork that indicates that as well. So that's that. I'd like to know what number we're talking about. Our SAM staff report for this on fiscal impact says that the city has proposed flow allocations from calendar year 2016 would be used in place of the current meters.
Matthew,
And
I think we've conceded that we're not gonna do that.
And then I have the agenda report for the April 17th city council meeting in which the number 52.2% is going to be the request submitted to SAM. And we have now heard city representatives saying 55-point-something%. So what, I don't wanna get an answer right now, but I'd like to know what is the number we're actually talking about? And my other comment is that as Director Boyd has related, GCSD spent 2 or 3 years trying to get relief from being overcharged as our flow percentages went up virtually every month. And that's how long it took to get it fixed. And the SAM director whose seat I'm sitting in, Director Warren, you probably have all heard this like we do all the time, was a math major. He, about a year and a half into that process, he told me, and he stated this in public at the meetings, that by his estimate, the district had paid an extra $250,000 by then because of being overcharged. And by the time it was over, he just was sputtering about what the numbers would have been. And so, as a GCSD director, I'm not looking favorably at any kind of recompense, because we ate the overcharge. If the city can prove there's an overcharge, let's fix that, but don't come to us for the money, okay?
I don't think the city is asking anyone for any kind of recompense. The city wants to move forward.
That's
The
good.
city is going to be calibrating its meters, and once they've been calibrating, we'll be looking to see what our actual flow is, and moving forward with that actual flow. That's all the city is asking for. The city has said, up till now, we will pay, and was it 55.4%
was
is what we agreed
calendar year.
on.
I'm glad to hear that.
Jim? Well, I'm looking at the agenda report for the city council. And like you, Matthew, I see that it refers to the 2018-19 budget. And since we're only 5 days after the adoption of this agenda item by the city council, I'm confused as to how, there hasn't been a city council meeting on this, so I'm confused about how the number that appeared to have been adopted by the city council has been changed. And I also heard Mayor Penrose mention a mid-year budget adjustment. And I'd like more information on a mid-year budget adjustment on this, because I really don't understand. And just to respond to Mr. Dowdy's comment about arguing about this every year, Scott, I don't recall arguing about this every year, do you?
No.
Thank you.
John, can you?
Chairman,
Sure.
so, we took the budget item on the 17th was a preliminary review of the budget to get comments and response back. There was no adoption, official action. That's clearly in the recommendations of what we did. In that process, the council said, I'll speak to the answer, there was a question that was raised about negotiating with the general manager. What our council said was, come back and talk to the general manager about this. No one was suggesting that the general manager would have a magic wand to be able to answer this without coming to you as the board of directors. All we said is, and all the council gave us direction to, meet as we did today and talk about these issues and work through it. Again, I think this is what we've been talking about for a long time, about collaboration, working together, and trying to get along and answer the issues. So I think the council was appropriately gave their direction to do so, and that's why we met, and that's why we did that. So that's basically where we are. So we were talking about the 52.2% was what our current this 17-18 budget is based on, the 52.2% flow. So let's be clear, that was the budget amount, and what we're suggesting is that we abide by the 55%, whatever, that's in the budget, that's built in the budget. What we're asking for is, when we come back at mid-year budget, we have 4 to 6 months of dry time data with calibrated meters, and we at least talk about the flow across the board and look at where those flows come in as compared to the calculation flow. Hell, we may get, sorry, but it may get to the point where our flow meters show more than what your calculation is.
Right.
I have to be prepared for that reality.
Right.
But the bottom line is all we're saying and all we're asking for, and again, tonight doesn't have to be that night, because that's not on your agenda, I think, to be able to make that decision and recommendation. Your council will tell you that. But what we're suggesting is that we have an opportunity to come back in this forum, talk about the flows, and hopefully maybe that leads to a conversation about flat rate in a different way or whatever anyway, out of that. So we're suggesting prospectively. We understand the retroactive issues for both Montera and Granada are both sore issues that go back, we get that. I also understand that the city of Half Moon Bay, with different leadership, may have been, part of that challenge and issue for each of the other agencies in terms of that retroactive. I understand, we're working through a lot of history and a lot of that. We're trying to move forward, and what we're saying is, let's look prospectively at this. That's all we're suggesting.
Thank you.
To that last comment, I don't think anyone blamed any member agency what we're upset about, and I know Leonard was rightfully upset about the expense. But it took us a long time to figure it out, and by that time, there was a lot of water through the partial flume, and it was a difficult situation we were in, and trying to find a way out of that. We discussed it at several meetings, and but I don't recall anything other than the frustration with the situation, not with the people in that.
I think you're right, that's correct. We always felt it was a technical problem,
Right,
and it just had to be fixed. So-
right. So, John, I just want you to know, in that situation, as painful as that was, even with the guy who was feeling it the most, there wasn't a finger of blame on that. It was a strictly technical problem, and it just took us, it bedeviled us. And it's a weird thing to say, but we celebrated when we found the short in the meter that led to the principal cause of it. And it was really frustrating that it took that long to get to it. But it's a complex system. It took a while, and now we know some more things to keep an eye on. But that wasn't, I think you can set aside any concern about that, because that wasn't a frustration with people, that was a frustration with the product.
Thank you. So, we've had a lot of discussion. So, how do we move ahead there?
Well, because it was presented at the city council
Right.
as that the city would be negotiating with the general manager, clearly I had no direction from this body as to what the intent was, but now with the clarification that the changes aren't being looked at for the 18-19 budget, then I would like the direction from this board on how you would like me to proceed with the discussions with the member agency managers, specifically having to do with going forward and looking at this, if this board is interested in looking back at this, say in 6 months at the sort of the mid-year budget point, once that data is available, that's gonna take staff time. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm asking, because we typically have not done a mid-year budget analysis here at SAM. This year was the first time we did one, and it does take staff time, and because we do have a policy, I wanna make sure that I'm not out there expending staff resources on something that is not in the direction that this board wants. So if you do want to say, yes, gather that data, continue to have the discussion with the city about the city flow meter measurements in comparison to SAM, and then bring it back at the midpoint, then that's what staff will do.
I'd very much like to see that happen, and I know it takes staff time, but this is an issue that it's been an issue for Granada, it's been an issue for Montara, it's now an issue for Half Moon Bay. And I think with my interest in seeing a flat rate considered, having the data will help us with that consideration a lot better, and so I'd like to see us just look at it. And we're not saying do an adjustment to the mid-year budget, that's never been really my thought, but a mid-year, well, you said it, analysis, I think is what we should be doing.
And I wanted to clarify something that Director Slater-Carter said. That sort of annual debate about the flows may not have risen to the point of this board, but I can tell you in the 3 budget years I've been involved, it's been a contentious discussion at every single budget discussion with the member agency managers. Your flow versus my flow, and which one's correct.
Right.
It's good that you've got the perspective from, especially from the review of all this, plus the 2016. I'd like to, so you distributed this to everybody, right? So this from 2012, December 10th, 2012. The recommendations in this staff report, I just want to tell you what happened with the recommendations. There's a recitation in the minutes, very briefly summarizing these recommendations. And I believe, probably reading off the section headers, the underlined text under recommendations. A discussion ensued. Following discussion, Director Boyd moved and Director Harvey seconded the motion to adopt staff recommendations to SAM's flow measurement program. 8 ayes, 0 noes, motion passed. If we do these things, you'll get better than a mid-year review. You'll have something very affirmative that I think we all will have good reason to feel like is good information, sound judgment. These recommendations that were brought to us by staff were very good, and so now we have this in hand. Now we know what the recommendation, what this board voted for. We may want to fine tune this a bit, who knows, but this is really solid. This is a good set of recommendations that staff brought us.
And I can tell you, after watching all the meetings involved in that,
Yep.
it was discussed in great detail with a lot of feedback and input to get to this point, and it was clear that the member managers also were weighing in and providing feedback all through the process. So, I mean, it's great for staff that's here now and wasn't here then, that we have this, because this should be our guiding principle for looking at the flows.
It is.
It is. And whether or not,
So that's a
It
good
was-
positive outcome
Yes.
of tonight's agenda item and the concerns raised, because now we've got this document freshly in front of us, and it's still pretty good set of guidelines.
Yes.
That's our plan of record, so
Yep.
now we can execute to that. So I hope you get a chance to take a look at the recommendations, because this is,
Yeah.
it's more than,
Right
it's
here.
more than you're asking for.
It is more.
Yeah.
yep,
So any more discussion? I mean, this is very.
No,
Okay.
well, let me say that I agree with Scott that it should be looked at. I'm hoping we have the staff time to do the additional, work that Half Moon Bay is requesting.
I think it's in here that we've already recommended that we do it. And that's not anything additional.
Is this new?
To what this is. This is from 2012. It says, use the mid-plant meter flows as adjusted for treatment plant flow reporting to the Regional Quality Board and for calculation of SAM MA flow apportionment.
Yes, and I'm
Yeah.
asking, is this new, or you've been doing this all along?
This is how I report to the state. I use the mid-plant flow meter to report to the state.
Okay, so
it would be more of the analysis of, okay, comparing to the Half Moon Bay meters, and what does that flow look like, and then how does that go back and compare to the percentage allocations? That we typically don't go back and review this year in comparison to last year, specifically for budget purposes.
Well, if you look
That
at
would be-
if you look at the comparison to the Half Moon Bay meter readings, this doesn't spell out the technical details of the arrangement between the two agencies to, you know, who brings the data, who does the comparison. At that point in time, Half Moon Bay was providing the data, and so, you know, I don't think we ever imagined that might stop for some reason, but turnover, whatever happened. There, it sounds like we want to get a mutual agreement on, okay, where's the data come from, who provides it, when, who checks it, how do we agree on how we compare it? Those kind of things, those are just logistics.
Yeah.
And that, I think we started today in the conversation that Half Moon Bay recognizes the responsibility that they own the meters, getting that solidified, and then from a perspective of the comparison, we can have a future discussion about how we will obtain that data and utilize that data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the flow numbers, just for your information, are in I believe, every SAM agenda under manager's report.
Mhm.
So you can go back to November of 2017 and see that Half Moon Bay's flow was over 57%.
Yes,
So,
I think that's the problem.
And,
That's
and,
the calculation, not our actual flows, and that's the crux of the issue that we're saying is, we would just like to have actual comparative to flows as compared to the calculation method, which is, we take whatever's left between Montero and Granada. That's the calculation in its simplest form,
So-
understood, you
Right.
We
know,
should not have
and
to
maybe
say
it's the
same.
right answer,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, if I may speak, that is not a calculation, those are actually measured flows from a calibrated flow meters, those are only summation, addition of flows. If we were to use the flows from the flow meter belonging to Half Moon Bay, even those would be summation, because there are 4 flow meters which measures flows coming from different parts of Half Moon Bay. So finally, at the end of it, we're going to add 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 flow meters. It is the same method which we are adopting now. It's not like calculation using hi-fi equations, it's just summation.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make it.
yeah,
That, I
Thank
just wanna point out, I mean, recommendation, the second recommendation, the quality assurance on plant flows. The sentence 2, deviations between the primary meters and the secondary metering systems in excess of 2% will initiate a staff investigation, immediate corrective action, and a report to the board.
Mhm.
So, this is, if we're following this, and now that everyone's on the same page,
mhm.
if we follow this, none of this stuff is gonna linger. And none of us wants it to linger. We
Right.
all want to like go after these problems the day we, the day we find it. Maybe the week we find it, it depends on how big it is. But here, we shouldn't, if we're operating according to what the board directed at the time, we'll be on top of this stuff. And it
Right.
doesn't have to be contentious. I mean, it'll just be engineering problems to solve.
So I think at this point, based on what we are currently doing and continuing to do that, I don't think there's additional staff cost, staff time. However, since we haven't had a discussion about how frequently we would evaluate it, is it monthly, is it weekly, is it quarterly? The letter from the city implied a certain expectation of a more frequent analysis than we do on our own meters. I think once I've had the opportunity to have the discussion with the member agency managers, I can bring that back if I think that there's gonna be an impact on staff time.
thank you. Great.
thank you.
So are we done?
I believe
That was
I've
very, very
gotten enough
fruitful discussion,
direction
yeah.
at this point to get started. Thank you.
Before somebody changes it.
Anyway,
Yeah.
okay, so we all have an idea of direction here, we're all happy with that. And
Yes.
thank you for all your input and everybody else's help with this. Okay, so move ahead now to, now we have a general manager's report, number 8, item each.
Well, I'd like to direct you to the flow, no. This is what it always looks like. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for the report showing basically what happened in March. And I want to point out, because these things sometimes just fly by, we get so busy doing the day-to-day that we don't recognize this. I want to thank and recognize Tim Costello. In March, he reached 30 years of working for SAM.
That is just
Are you to
pure
be
stupidity.
congratulated somebody? That's the question.
I have asked him why, but he's so dedicated and so, this is his life, that I can't even get him to stop thinking about it when he's off work, because I don't think he ever really is off work. But, so I did want to point that out, and we will also want to note that in the month of April, George Long will reach 30 years as
Wow.
well.
Very good.
So that, some long-term employees with lots of knowledge of the SAM system and the member agency system, because both George and Tim started in collections. So, there's a lot of history here, and I speak for myself that I appreciate it all the time that I have staff that have been here that long that I can go and ask questions, because when you have that turnover and it's not always captured, that knowledge is not always captured somewhere, frequently I do have to go back to the long-term employees and say, okay, well, tell me the history of this. So it has been invaluable to have access to basically the encyclopedias of SAM for that 30-year
For sure.
period.
For sure. Very good, thank you. Congratulations. So now we have, thank you for that. And now we have item 9, attorney's report.
Yeah.
I had brought up to General Manager Marshall that there was a bill out, SB 831, that was going to undo the deal that was worked out in 2016 that has to do with accessory dwelling units and how they can be charged when an accessory dwelling unit is created. This is not an issue for SAM, it's an issue for the member agencies, because, but the potential, the existing bill, the existing law as negotiated would have prohibited retail sewer proprietors as well as water for requiring a connection to an accessory dwelling unit if it was within the existing space of the dwelling or an existing accessory structure. But if there was an expansion of the floor area, then you could charge according to a formula that was sort of negotiated through the way negotiations take place in legislation. It was not something that anybody was in the business was happy about. Proportionate to the burden based upon size or plumbing fixtures. Now, some agencies do it that way, others don't. So it's sort of a one-size-fits-all in the legislation. The way it's proposed to be revised, it would prohibit any accessory dwelling unit being subjected to any impact fees, connection fees, capacity charges, or any other fees levied by a local agency, school district, special district, or water corporation. Now, that language is broad enough that it could be construed to forbid you for charging for the actual cost of providing service to those dwellings. It's very extreme language as far as I'm concerned. So as I said, CASA sent out a notice. This bill is going before a committee. I think it's either this week or next week. And CASA called out for its members to send letters in opposition.
What bill
I
is
can
that
forward
again?
this
What's the
information.
bill and who's sponsoring?
It's SB 831, and it's Wyckowski. He's the same senator who was involved in the negotiations back in 2016. Very upsetting for those of us who were I was on the fringes of that.
How did it do in 2016?
What's that?
How did he fare in 2016?
Well, there was a lot of political pressure to get the bill passed. Yeah, there was a lot of it was going to be, what we were advised by the lobbyists, it was not gonna be possible to stop that. It was gonna go through, there was a need for affordable housing, and this was one way to make it happen. And a quick,
It's a gift.
that's the concept.
I
So-
can't even imagine.
Do you have the
It's not gonna
number of
stand
the
up.
2016 bill?
SB 1069.
Look at you, just rattled that
That
off.
one I know, I was very involved, I was sending language to the people that were going and taking it to the legislators.
And that got passed.
That got passed, yeah, and it was, the political force behind it was such that it was gonna pass, and the question was, opposing it was not gonna be, was not gonna be helpful.
And that was for, quote, affordable,
The idea is to
Granny
create
units.
affordable housing through
Yeah.
creating accessory dwelling units, granny flats, turning your garage into something, a living space, that sort of thing. And if you had a shed in the backyard, turn that into a little house. I mean, that's sort of the concept, and it was felt that there were these terrible fees that these agencies were imposing that were preventing these dwelling units from being created, and thereby exacerbating the housing shortage in the state. So this was sort of this is the compromise that was worked out, and now it's being tossed aside. So it could be a significant issue for your agencies, and I believe that Montera and Granada are both CASA agencies, so they
Yes.
probably would have gotten the information about this. If the city wants, I'd be happy to forward what I got from CASA to you if you think if you're interested in that.
Thanks.
And the only other thing I wanted to point out was, I had forwarded some information from CSDA regarding, a bill that's moving forward with regards to JPAs and funding, retirement obligations and, severability. And, so I did forward that. It seems to be picking up steam. And certainly, it doesn't affect SAM per se, but affects JPAs, so obviously the member agencies to any JPA would be directly affected by this. I am on an advisory group for CSDA regarding, these types of things, as well as CASA. So, just letting you know that, as this moves forward, we'll wanna keep an eye on that one.
Right, CSDA's taken the lead on that. CASA, I think CASA probably has members on both sides of that, but, I mean, basically what it says is, it'll apply retroactively to all joint exercise of powers agreements, and they shall be reopened to include a provision holding member agencies to the party, jointly and severally liable for all of the public agency, that's the joint powers agencies, of obligations to PERS. That's a pretty radical statement, approach, I think. So, wanted to make you aware of that as well.
Yeah.
So they try to drive people out of PERS because it's the only safe way to approach it.
Well, and originally it was discussed this way, and then they backed off and said, okay, only for prospective, so newly created JPAs, and then, my understanding is the union stepped in and they went right back to the everybody.
Yeah, there was a JPA that, I don't remember what it was called, Public Works LA or something
So
like that.
they're trying to keep people from backing out.
Yeah, they're trying to keep people from, I mean, basically what happened, there were a couple of bad actors in other types of JPAs that weren't enterprise district, doing enterprise functions. And there was no money. There was one case, there were like 120 people retired and their benefits just sort of went poof. And so the legislature, the unions obviously aren't interested in having that happen ever again. And so they're really the force behind this. PERS sort of floated it and said, nah, we don't wanna do that, but the unions definitely picked it up. And we've been hearing talk for months, says, oh, we're gonna walk it back from joint and several liability. I mean, that means each of the member agencies could be responsible for 100% of the retirement in this example, if SAM was to go defunct. That's pretty draconian.
And if this passes, you would have to reflect that in each of your financial statements every year, the value of that. So, I mean, it's pretty broad. And now that the unions are backing it, understandably from their position, but it's definitely, I think, gotten stronger rather than weaker. And the information that I forwarded had CSAC, it had League of Cities, CSDA, I mean, everybody's coming out because all of these would be the member agencies to these JPAs.
Right.
So, it's definitely one to watch, and I forget what the bill number is on that one.
That's AB 1912.
1912,
Sponsor is Rodriguez.
so, another one, and between Carl and I, we pretty much learn about all these things from all the listservs we're on, but I do try to forward those when I think they might be relevant either to SAM or any of the member agencies.
Well, thank you
Right,
for that.
so I mentioned this, as I said, I mentioned this, and she wanted me to bring it forward to you, so you can take it back to the
Thank
member
you.
agencies and others be aware of it.
Thank you.
And that's what I had, that's all the bad news I'm gonna give you tonight.
Oh gee.
Okay, so now we have item 10, director's reports.
I have a report. Clemens and I, through, it was CASA, I think so, watched a web broadcast on distributed water treatment systems. And it was very interesting they interviewed folks from New York and the East Coast. This was in particularly looking at water recycling in areas where there's no need for additional water. But having distributed recycling programs for other reasons other than to give additional water to or to create additional water for the community. I think it
It was
might be-
water reuse.
Yeah, it was on water reuse, and it may be resident on that website. It was interesting to find out that Montera per mile of pipeline, sewer pipeline, has more pump stations than the city of New York.
We're a little hillier than the city of New York.
But it's distributed over such a large area, we were thinking maybe on the outskirts, there might be a few more, and you know, it has to go up and down under rivers and so on, but anyway. It was a very worthwhile and thought-provoking, presentation, and we appreciated that.
Can you send the link?
I will see if I can't send the link.
And that's, through Sam, because Sam's a member of water reuse.
Right,
So it was free to members of water reuse.
that was it, yeah.
Thank you, guys. Any more items?
I was thinking about moving to extend the meeting by an hour, but
Now we have item 11, topics for future board consideration.
I
Yeah.
don't I don't see anything to add.
Okay, so now we can, so are we ready to adjourn the meeting? Okay. The meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.